She stood quietly near the back of the room, unnoticed, as people in black whispered and exchanged polite condolences. Her stepmother moved through the space like a hostess at a formal dinner, composed, elegant, and cold. Beside her, Vanessa, the ever-favored daughter, accepted embraces and sympathetic looks as if she alone had lost someone. No one looked her way. No one even acknowledged that she might be grieving too. She wasn't invited to speak, wasn't mentioned in the program, wasn't asked if she needed anything. It was as if she was simply an outsider who had wandered into someone else's family tragedy. The memorial was held in the same house she'd grown up in, a house that no longer held any trace of her. Her mother's pictures had been removed years ago, her childhood bedroom redecorated and stripped of familiarity. The smell of old books and coffee that once filled the hallway had been replaced by expensive perfumes and the sterile scent of polish. Everything in the house had been touched by Julia. And now, even in death, it felt like her father had been claimed by them too. She clutched the old leather watch in her hand, his watch, the one he used to check when picking her up from school, the one he'd let her play with as a child when she curled up beside him on the couch. It was the only thing left that still felt like him. Julia stood at the front, her voice calm and calculated as she thanked everyone for coming, for supporting their family through such a difficult time. When she spoke about his legacy, she talked about the company he built, the decisions they made together, and the life they'd shared. No mention of the daughter who had once been his shadow. Not a word about the long nights he'd spent helping with homework, the birthdays celebrated with handmade cards, the tearful hugs after scraped knees or broken hearts. It was like those years never existed. Like she never existed. Then, as the guests gathered around the food table and the soft murmur of polite conversation resumed, she heard it. Julia's voice, quiet but sharp, slicing through the air behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was meant for her. The words, dismissive and precise, landed like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling outward until the room felt colder, smaller, more distant than ever. She held her breath, not out of fear, but out of control. The control she'd learned over the years to protect herself, to stay invisible, to survive in the shadow of a family that had never truly welcomed her. But beneath that silence, there was something else, something that simmered quietly behind her eyes, settled deep in her chest like a secret flame. Because what Julia didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that weeks before his death, her father had reached out to her. In a quiet CAF, with tired eyes and a trembling hand, he had given her something. A sealed envelope. Had said it was important. That if anything happened to him, she shouldn't open it. Just deliver it to a man named Cartwright. That was all. She hadn't opened it. Not once. Not even when he died. Not even when she was left out of the funeral planning. She had simply kept it close, tucked away in her bag, the wax seal still unbroken. She didn't know what it said, what it contained, or why he had made her promise not to read it. But she trusted him. And now, as she stood there, invisible among people who shared his name but not his truth, she reached into her purse and closed her hand around it. The envelope was still there, cool and solid in her grasp. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like proof. Not just of something legal or financial, but of something deeper. Something right. She didn't come to argue or demand attention. She didn't need their validation or their apology. All she needed was that envelope, and the knowledge that her father had wanted her to have it. The house didn't change overnight, but she felt whatever came next, Julia moved she would be ready. At first, not with anger. It was subtle. Not with a new set of throw pillows on the couch, but with quiet certainty. Different food in the fridge, because the truth always finds its voice. The sound of heels on the hardwood floors instead of the soft padding of her mother's scream to be heard. Her father seemed happy, at least, that's what he said. He smiled a little more, talked about moving forward, used phrases like starting fresh and new beginnings, but none of it felt real to her. Everything she knew was slowly being replaced, and no one seemed to notice that she was shrinking in the process. She remembered the way her mother used to sing while cooking, off-key but cheerful, humming familiar tunes that made the kitchen feel like home. After Julia moved in, the music stopped. The kitchen became a space of rules and routines, where laughter was replaced by performance, and meals felt like events rather than moments shared. Julia was graceful, elegant, and impossibly poised. Her words were always polished, her movements precise, her tone sweet with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. And though she never said anything cruel outright, not at first, there was always a feeling of being watched, measured, and quietly dismissed. Vanessa arrived with Julia, older by 2 years and already effortlessly popular. She walked through life as if she belonged to it, confident and loud in ways that turned heads. Teachers adored her. Neighbors praised her. Her father, too, seemed taken in by her bright smile and witty remarks. She brought life into the house, but not the kind that made it warmer. It was the kind that cast shadows in corners that had once been safe. Soon, her father's attention drifted, subtly at first, then obviously. He still loved her. She never doubted that. But he had someone new to protect, to build around. And she, his daughter, his quiet, observant child, began to fade from view. The living room, once filled with framed photos of family trips and candid moments, slowly became a gallery of curated perfection. Photos of Julia and Vanessa adorned the shelves, the mantel, the hallway walls. Her own pictures, school awards, birthday memories, hand-drawn cards, were taken down or moved to less visible corners, some disappearing altogether. Her bedroom was redecorated without her input. The pastel walls her mother once painted were covered in muted neutrals. Her books were boxed up and placed in storage. Even her childhood blanket, frayed but beloved, was replaced with a stylish new comforter that smelled like someone else's home. No one asked her what she thought. No one asked if she was okay. They called these changes necessary, part of building a new life. Her father, once her safest place, had become distracted, pulled in different directions by his new responsibilities. He worked later hours, came home with stories about Julia's ideas for the business, Vanessa's accomplishments at school, upcoming charity events they were hosting together. He always hugged her when he saw her. Always smiled when she passed. But there was a distance forming, a quiet shift in his presence that she didn't know how to close. She adapted. That's what she always did. She stopped asking to be picked up from school and took the bus instead. She learned to cook her own meals when Julia began making dinner only for herself and Vanessa. She completed her homework in her room with the door closed, because the dining table had become Vanessa's domain. She didn't complain when her father missed parent-teacher conferences or forgot her recital. She learned to say, "It's fine, and I understand," because saying anything else felt like betrayal. She thought if she just waited patiently, things would get better again. But things didn't get better. They got quieter. At family dinners, when Julia hosted her elegant meals with candles and matching place settings, she sat silently at the end of the table. Julia asked Vanessa about her day, praised her grades, joked about her dating life. Her father laughed, nodded, chimed in with the kind of warmth he used to reserve for their bedtime talks. No one asked about her day. No one noticed when she stopped eating or excused herself early. She became a ghost in her own home, hovering at the edge of conversations, present but invisible. She tried, in small ways, to be seen. She brought home certificates from school, quietly laid them on the kitchen counter. They disappeared, never mentioned. She cleaned the garage, the place she and her father once built projects together. No one noticed. On his birthday, she saved up to buy him a special pen set engraved with his initials, something thoughtful, something personal. Julia thanked her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and the next day, the pen was gone from the desk, replaced by a sleeker, more expensive one that matched the new office decor. It wasn't just that she felt forgotten. It was that she felt slowly erased. Every version of her that once existed in that house, the little girl who built Lego castles on the carpet, the teenager who read books under the stairs, the daughter who once believed her father saw her above all else, was fading. And no one seemed to notice. Or care. She began spending more time away. At the library. At friends' houses. Sometimes she walked without a destination, just to feel the cold air and remind herself that she was still real, still breathing. When she was home, she stayed in her room. The walls felt unfamiliar, but at least the silence was consistent. She journaled in secret, writing stories about girls who were seen, who were chosen, who mattered. She didn't write about herself. Not directly. But her handwriting betrayed the truth she couldn't say aloud. Her father, for all his warmth, seemed not to know how to help. Or maybe he chose not to see the cracks. Maybe it was easier to believe everyone was adjusting just fine. He tried, sometimes, to bridge the gap, a soft knock on her door, an offer to grab ice cream, a quick chat in the car. But those moments were fleeting, and often interrupted by Julia or Vanessa, or the latest phone call that required his immediate attention. Every time he turned away, even for just a second, something inside her curled in on itself a little more. She learned to carry herself quietly, to expect nothing, to celebrate small victories alone. She stopped asking for hugs. She stopped trying to fit into conversations that didn't have room for her. She didn't cry in front of them. She didn't shout or slam doors. She disappeared without leaving the house. It was easier that way. Safer. Over time, the word family became something abstract, something distant and fragile. It was no longer about comfort or closeness. It was about survival. Appearances. Roles assigned and played. Julia played the devoted wife. Vanessa played the perfect daughter. Her father played the peacemaker, the provider, the man too tired to question the imbalance. And she played the part of the silent daughter, the one who never made a fuss, the one who could be trusted not to ruin the illusion. And even when it hurt, when the silence became heavy, when the rooms felt colder, when the memories of her mother began to blur at the edges, she held it all inside. Because somewhere deep down, she believed that one day, somehow, someone would notice. Someone would remember that she had been there, too. That she had mattered. That she had loved him. It happened on an afternoon that should have been ordinary, unremarkable, another silent page in the slow erosion of what she used to call home. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. The kind of silence that seems to wait, as if listening for something. She had come home early from school, a half-day due to teacher conferences. Her father wasn't home, his car missing from the driveway. The sun filtered dimly through the large windows, casting long, pale shadows across the polished floors. She didn't announce her arrival. She rarely did anymore. The sense of belonging had long since faded. She moved quietly through the hallway, not wanting to disturb whatever order had been established in her absence. From the top of the stairs, she could hear voices. Julia's voice, smooth, practiced, always carrying a certain condescension even when she tried to sound pleasant. And Vanessa's, lighter, faster, like someone playing at being older than she was. The words floated up the staircase, too faint to make out completely until she stepped closer, stopped halfway down, and listened. There was laughter, but not the warm kind. The kind that makes the skin prickle, that feels sharp and private. She heard her name, just once, but it landed like a slap. Her heart beat faster, instinctively, as if bracing itself. She leaned closer to the wall, holding her breath, every sense alert. Then came the line. Quiet, tossed off like a passing joke. So casual, it might have gone unnoticed if not for the weight it carried. Julia said it as if it were fact, as if it needed no debate or explanation. She's not even real family. 6 words. Spoken without hesitation, without concern, like someone commenting on the weather or the brand of tea they preferred. The words hung in the air, invisible and suffocating. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stood there, frozen, as if the world had tilted and gravity no longer worked the same way. It wasn't just the cruelty of the words, it was the certainty in them. The quiet conviction that she didn't belong, that she had never belonged, no matter how many years she had lived under that roof, no matter how many memories she had built in that house. It wasn't even said to her, but it struck harder than anything ever spoken to her face. That line carved something permanent inside her, a cut that didn't bleed but left a mark that would never fade. Because it confirmed what she had always feared but never dared to believe entirely, that in their eyes, she was an intruder. An afterthought. A shadow. She didn't confront them. She didn't cry or slam a door or run down the stairs demanding answers. Instead, she turned around, climbed back to her room, and closed the door behind her with a careful slowness, as if any sound might give her away. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, her hands resting motionless in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her body felt numb, but her chest ached. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. In the quiet, aching way a heart does when it's finally forced to admit something it tried so hard not to know. That night, she went to dinner as usual. She sat at the end of the table. Julia passed her the breadbasket like nothing had happened. Vanessa talked about her upcoming dance recital. Her father complimented Julia on the roast. Everything appeared normal. But she saw it all differently now. The polite smiles, the casual conversation, the way no one noticed her silence, they were all part of a performance she hadn't realized she was watching. They were acting out the script of a family that didn't include her. And now, with that one line, she could no longer pretend otherwise. From that moment on, her understanding of home shifted. It was no longer a place of safety or memory. It was a set, a stage where roles were played, where she was the extra, necessary for a scene, but not the story. She spoke less. She stayed out later. She stopped making any effort to participate in the performance. It wasn't rebellion, it was resignation. A quiet surrender to a truth that had already been written in someone else's words. School became her sanctuary, not because it was joyful, but because it was neutral. There were no expectations there beyond what she could control: grades, assignments, attendance. She poured herself into her work, into books, into numbers and facts and theories that didn't lie. She became the kind of student teachers appreciated but rarely remembered. Quiet, competent, invisible. Just the way she needed to be. Her friendships grew thin, stretched by her silence and absence. No one asked questions. And she was grateful. Because she didn't have the words to explain what it felt like to live in a house that whispered you didn't matter. The line Julia said echoed in her mind for weeks. Sometimes, she would hear it while brushing her teeth, while tying her shoes, while walking between classes. It replayed without warning, without mercy. Not even real family. It became a lens through which she viewed every interaction. Every time Julia introduced Vanessa as her daughter, every time her father failed to correct it, every time she wasn't included in the group photos or the family outings or the stories told at dinner. She began to doubt her memories. Had her father ever really made her feel special? Or had that too been a performance? She knew the answer in her heart, but doubt is a powerful thing. It creeps in like water through a crack, slow but relentless. And yet, she didn't hate them. Not entirely. What she felt was more complex, more exhausting. It was grief. Grief for the version of her life that could have been. For the father who once knelt beside her when she scraped her knee. For the bedtime stories that used to end with a kiss on the forehead. For the birthday parties where he helped her blow out candles. That father still existed somewhere in her memory, and she clung to those pieces, even as the present made them feel like fiction. But even in that quiet sadness, something else began to take root. A hardness. A resolve. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't loud, but it was there. In the way she held her shoulders a little straighter. In the way she looked people in the eye when they tried to diminish her. In the way she stopped apologizing for existing. That one line, the line she never forgot, had cracked something open in her. It hurt. It bled. But it also cleared the fog. She saw them clearly now. She saw herself clearly, too. She wasn't going to ask for a place anymore. She wasn't going to beg to be loved. She wasn't going to wait for someone to choose her. From that point on, she would choose herself. And while she didn't know what that would look like yet, she knew what it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be silence. It wouldn't be shadows. It wouldn't be sitting at the end of the table hoping someone passed the bread. It would be more. Because she was more. And even though they couldn't see it, she could. And someday, when everything changed, and she knew, of course, somehow, that it
Here's
would,
the detailed
they would
text
look
for
back and
chapter
realize
3
what
written in
they'd
a
cast
continuous,
aside, narrative style,
but by
in
then,
English,
she wouldn't
from the
need them to.
third-person point of view, without dialogue or section breaks, and with a character count exceeding 4,000, she didn't announce her decision aloud. There was no formal declaration, no visible shift that others could point to and say, this is when it started. But inside, something settled. She began to withdraw, not in a way that screamed for attention, but in the quiet, methodical way someone does when they've stopped expecting the world to bend in their favor. Her movements became more deliberate, more calculated. She began to map her days around avoidance, learning the subtle rhythms of the house to determine when the kitchen would be empty, when Julia and Vanessa would be out, when the living room would be free of the low hum of laughter that no longer invited her. She trained herself to listen for footsteps before leaving her room, to carry her shoes to the front door instead of wearing them through the hall, to memorize the creaks in the floorboards and move in silence. It became second nature, like breathing through a cloth, slightly restrained, slightly bitter, but survivable. At school, she maintained a perfect mask. Her teachers still marked her as attentive and respectful. Her classmates saw her as the girl who never caused drama, never broke rules, never asked for anything. She became known for her reliability, for the way she quietly excelled without competing, for the way she never inserted herself where she wasn't explicitly welcomed. But the truth was, she had grown tired of fighting for a place that others had no intention of offering. The tension at home had calcified into habit. She no longer hoped for inclusion. She no longer felt the sting of being left out. The wound had closed, though the scar remained sensitive beneath the surface. She spent most evenings in her room, the door closed not as a rebellion, but as a shield. Her space became her only sanctuary, the one place in the house where she could curate her environment, her sounds, her silence. She filled the small room with pieces of herself, books stacked along the windowsill, lined journals in the drawer beneath her bed, photographs of moments she chose to preserve. Not the ones taken in family portraits or at orchestrated events, but snapshots of sunlit walks, of a friend's laugh frozen mid-motion, of autumn leaves piled beside an old bench. These were reminders that life existed outside the walls she now kept between herself and them. There was a growing distance between her and her father, not born of a single fight or confrontation, but of a slow accumulation of missed chances and unspoken truths. He noticed her less, though she wasn't sure if that was due to his own distractions or because she had become skilled at hiding in plain sight. He continued to live beside her but no longer with her. When he passed her in the hallway, his smile was automatic. When he knocked on her door, it was always brief, always followed by a question related to logistics, dinner plans, weekend arrangements, school forms. Rarely anything deeper. The man who once knew her favorite songs and the stories behind every childhood scar now seemed unsure of how to speak to her without a script. She didn't blame him outright, though sometimes, in her quietest moments, resentment flickered. But she understood that people were not always cruel by intention. Sometimes, they were simply tired. Distracted. Willing to believe that silence meant peace. Julia's presence in his life was a consuming one. She curated every detail of their shared world, from the furniture to the friends they entertained to the stories they told about themselves. With Vanessa always at the center, the image of a perfect, blended family was carefully constructed. Her absence from that image was not a flaw to them, but a convenience. Easier to smooth over than confront. Even so, she stayed polite. Always polite. She greeted Julia when they crossed paths. She complimented Vanessa when the moment demanded it. She smiled when guests came over and performed the role of the well-adjusted daughter, too well-behaved to ever cause concern. But behind that mask, she watched. She watched the way Vanessa flourished under constant attention, the way Julia lavished praise at the dinner table, the way her father's laughter seemed reserved only for stories in which she played no part. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she stopped needing their validation. Instead, she began to focus on building something apart from them. She applied herself to schoolwork with a new kind of focus. Not because she believed it would win their approval, but because it was one of the few places she could still measure her own worth. She took on extra assignments, spent long hours in the library, stayed after school for study groups and clubs, anything that allowed her to exist in a space where her contributions were acknowledged, even if impersonally. She didn't chase awards, but they came anyway. Certificates pinned on classroom boards. Emails sent to her father that he sometimes remembered to mention. But even when he forgot, she kept the copies, folded neatly and tucked away. The more she built her internal world, the less the external one had power over her. Julia's snide remarks, veiled as jokes, no longer stung in the same way. Vanessa's deliberate exclusion, her performative kindness in front of others, became transparent, almost laughable in its predictability. Her father's absence, while still a quiet ache, became something she learned to carry without breaking. She found resilience in the very act of enduring. She became the observer, the one who saw everything but revealed nothing, who learned people's weaknesses without ever using them. And yet, there were moments, brief and uninvited, when the weight of it all crept in. Birthdays passed with generic greetings. Holidays came and went with minimal acknowledgement. Family photos were taken without her. She began to recognize the look of discomfort that crossed her father's face when someone asked about his other daughter, as if the topic itself was a mistake. In those moments, the distance felt colder. Not just emotional, but historical. She was becoming a footnote in the story of her own family, remembered vaguely, spoken of rarely, slowly fading from the shared narrative they were building without her. Still, she held her ground. Not out of bitterness, but out of quiet determination. She would not let their neglect shape her entirely. She still had choices. She still had agency. So she chose herself, her peace, her goals, her sense of self-worth. She read books that challenged her thinking, watched films that stirred something unspoken, wrote long letters to no one that helped her understand her own voice. She didn't need them to see her. Not anymore. But one day, she hoped they would remember that she had been there, steady, watching, of course, quietly becoming someone they would no longer recognize. Here's the full detailed text for chapter 4 written as requested. The morning of the memorial was gray, she had created as if the sky itself had absorbed the weight of what was about to unfold. It was meant to protect her while she rebuilt. The rain didn't fall, but it was a space she claimed for herself in a world that had tried to shrink her down. And while they lived their curated lives under the pretense of harmony, she was learning how to survive, and how to fallen into a strange silence. Not
anger.
the kind she was used to, not
the
with
background
revenge,
hum of avoidance and polite
but
exclusion,
with a fierce,
but a
silent
heavier,
strength that
truer
no one
silence
saw
that
coming.
wrapped itself around the walls and settled in the spaces between every breath.
Her father was gone. Just like that. No warning, no farewell, no time to reconcile the long list of things that had been left unsaid. One moment he was in the world, half present, distracted, flawed, but still her father, and the next, he was gone, leaving only echoes of a life that had moved too quickly, with too little clarity. The call had come late at night. Julia's voice, shaken for the first time, had called her name from the hallway. There had been a car accident. A sudden, brutal end. The hours that followed passed in fragments, blurry images of hospital corridors, murmured apologies from doctors who avoided her eyes, a cold waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee. And then the truth of it, spoken plainly, he hadn't made it. The man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had read her bedtime stories with tired but willing eyes, who had somehow vanished emotionally in the years since Julia arrived, had now vanished entirely. Permanently. Irrevocably. There was no second chance now, no possibility of answers, of closure, of undoing all the quiet harm that had accumulated between them. She hadn't cried then. Not in the hospital, not on the ride home, not even when she closed the door to her room and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The grief didn't come all at once. It filtered in slowly, like fog seeping through window cracks. The morning of the memorial, she dressed carefully, choosing the black dress she had worn only once before, to a school function she had attended alone. It was simple, modest, and clean, and for some reason that felt important. She tied her hair back, not out of vanity, but to contain herself. To appear controlled. To prepare for what would inevitably be a performance, just like everything else that had unfolded in that house. Downstairs, the living room had been transformed. Julia had hired people, of course, florists, caterers, a string quartet playing soft music that didn't quite fit the occasion. White roses were arranged in perfect symmetry on every table, and framed photos of her father lined the mantel and windowsills. Most were recent, him and Julia at galas, him and Vanessa at school ceremonies, smiling, curated images of a life that barely acknowledged her existence. She stood at the edge of it all, barely noticed, while the room filled with people she didn't recognize. Co-workers. Distant family members. Neighbors who spoke with the comfortable confidence of those who believed they had truly known him. She listened to them speak in soft, reverent tones, describing a man who sounded familiar but distant. They called him generous, brilliant, charming. They talked about his laugh, his loyalty, his wisdom. No one spoke of the long hours he spent working, of the way his attention had scattered in the last few years, of the silence that had grown between him and his eldest daughter. Her. She was mentioned only in passing, when they remembered. Introduced awkwardly by Julia as his other daughter, as though she were a distant cousin or a forgotten obligation. When the formal part of the service began, she sat in the second row. Julia and Vanessa took the front, surrounded by friends and family. A minister, who had clearly never met her father, stood at the small podium and spoke of heaven, of peace, of God's plan. She listened with a stillness that masked the storm inside. This wasn't for her. It wasn't for her father either. It was for them, for the image, for the reputation, for the version of his life that they had chosen to display. She wondered if anyone else noticed that none of the photos included her. Not one. Years of birthdays, holidays, summer vacations, erased, edited out like she had never been part of the frame to begin with. Her heart ached, not just from the loss, but from the realization that even in death, she had been sidelined. The distance she had kept all those years had become permanent, not by choice, but by legacy. She had no speeches to give. No slideshow to offer. No one had asked her to speak. They didn't think she had anything to say, perhaps. Or maybe they just didn't want to hear it. But she had memories. Not perfect ones, not all warm or easy, but real. Like the way he used to bring her orange slices after soccer practice, even when he was tired. Or the way he once drove 4 hours to retrieve a science project she'd forgotten at her mother's house. Or the way he had cried, actually cried, when she broke her arm in 4th grade and wouldn't let go of his hand in the air. Those pieces of him still lived inside her, though no one in the room would have known it. As people stood to share their stories, she remained seated, hands folded, eyes steady. Vanessa read a poem. Julia spoke through tears that didn't quite reach her voice. Friends gave polished anecdotes. There was no place for her voice, and yet she carried more of him in her silence than most of them did in their words. She knew the parts of him that weren't in photos, that weren't easy to explain, the disappointments, the compromises, the way he had slowly slipped into a version of himself that she barely recognized, even as she mourned the loss of the man he used to be. When the ceremony ended, she slipped outside before the crowd could gather again. The sky had grown darker, the clouds thick with withheld rain. She walked to the edge of the garden where the service had spilled over, where no one was standing. There, beneath a quiet oak, she let herself feel it, just for a moment. Not the grand grief of movies or novels, but the private ache of a daughter who had lost something no one else seemed to notice was missing. She thought of all the things she would never say. Of the letter she had once written and never sent. Of the questions that would now never have answers. Of the final words they'd exchanged, something about dinner, maybe, or where she had left the car keys. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But she also thought of the will. The envelope Julia had tried to keep from her. The envelope her father had written in his own hand, addressed directly to her. Inside was more than money. It was acknowledgement. A quiet, firm decision. Proof that despite everything, despite the years of growing silence and emotional distance, he had still seen her. Had still remembered. Had still chosen her. And that changed everything. Even if no one else knew it yet. Of course. Here's the full text of Chapter 5 written in continuous, detailed narrative form, from a third-person perspective, as requested. The total character count exceeds 4,000, it came a few days after the memorial, in a plain manila envelope marked by the law office's crest in the corner. There was no ceremony to its arrival. The mail carrier rang the bell, left it at the door, and walked away. Julia had been the one to pick it up, her sharp eyes catching the return address immediately. She'd paused just long enough for her fingers to tighten around the paper before calling her stepdaughter's name from the bottom of the stairs. The sound of it, unnaturally sweet and clipped with restraint, echoed through the quiet house. The girl had come down slowly, already sensing the undercurrent. When she saw the envelope, her gaze met Julia's for a second too long. It was the first moment something shifted. Not a confrontation, but the moment before one. A flicker of tension that hung in the air as if the house itself was holding its breath. Julia didn't hand it over right away. She hesitated, almost said something, then placed it flat on the hallway table and turned away, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. It was the silence in that gesture that confirmed what the girl already suspected. This envelope held something important, something that would not align with the narrative Julia had so carefully maintained. She waited until the house was still again before touching it. She took it to her room, closed the door behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled the flap open. Inside was a typed letter, clipped to a second page. The first was straightforward, legal in tone, outlining the reading of her father's will and the details of its execution. But the second was handwritten, folded separately, and that was what stopped her breath. Her father's handwriting. Familiar and uneven, just as she remembered it from the notes he used to leave her on the kitchen counter when she was small. There was something raw about seeing his words again, like a voice resurrected for a moment. The letter wasn't long, but it held the weight of something Head needed her to know. He wrote of his regrets, of the distance that had grown, and of his awareness, however delayed, of the way she had been edged out of the life they once shared. He didn't make excuses, only acknowledgments. He wrote that he had always loved her, even in silence. Especially in silence. That what he had left behind for her was not meant as compensation, but as a statement. A correction. A truth. The final paragraph included a line that stayed with her long after she finished reading. I know I failed in many ways, but I never stopped being your father, and I want the world to remember that. The legal document confirmed what his words had already suggested. He had named her as the primary heir, not just of finances, but of the house, the land, the business shares Julia had long assumed would go to her and Vanessa. There were stipulations, of course. Trusts. Conditions. A few shared assets to be divided among them. But the bulk, what mattered, had been left to the one person who had remained invisible in life but was now central in death. The girl sat still for a long time after reading it, the paper resting in her lap like something sacred and combustible all at once. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition. About the truth finally having a voice. She didn't tell Julia right away. She let the knowledge settle, let it anchor her in the storm of grief and uncertainty. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in her own story. She walked through the house differently now. Not with arrogance, but with quiet purpose. She saw the subtle shifts in Julia's posture, the forced calmness in her tone, the way Vanessa's usual performative cheer had dulled to something colder. They knew, or at least suspected. They were waiting for confirmation. Waiting for her to announce it so they could contest, challenge, twist it. But she remained silent, for now. There was power in letting the truth live privately for a moment longer. The lawyer called a few days later to schedule the official reading. It was to be held at the office downtown. She arrived early, dressed in the same black dress she'd worn to the memorial, hair pulled back in the same tight style. Julia and Vanessa walked in 5 minutes before the appointment, faces composed but tight at the corners. Julia wore pearls. Vanessa wore black lace and heavy perfume. They sat opposite each other in the polished conference room, a sleek, too-cold space designed to sanitize emotion. The attorney, a gray-haired man with clear eyes, greeted them with professional detachment. When he began reading, he did not flinch. He recited the will as it was written, every line, every clause, every intention her father had set down with clarity and legal precision. The room shifted as he spoke. Julia's face froze first, then tightened. Vanessa fidgeted, her composure slipping with every sentence. But the girl sat still, not because she wasn't affected, but because this was not a victory. It was a reckoning. Her father's voice, through the will, was reclaiming a truth that had been buried for years beneath false smiles and selective memory. There was a pause after the reading. The kind of pause where no one quite knows how to move forward. Julia spoke first, her voice low, almost casual, masking fury in politeness. She asked questions. Pressed for clarifications. Suggested confusion. The lawyer remained firm. The will was valid. Witnessed. Notarized. Final. Vanessa looked stunned, then furious, then small. When they left the office, the city outside felt different, brighter, louder, more real. She walked a few steps ahead of them, not looking back. There was no confrontation, no dramatic scene. Just distance, widening in every step. The house would soon be hers, legally. But more than that, the story had changed. Her place in it, long erased, had been restored. Not because she fought for it, but because her father, in his final act, had chosen to correct the silence. She thought about what she would do now. Not with the assets, but with the truth. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want conflict. What she wanted was something far simpler. To live fully, without shrinking. To walk through the front door of her home and no longer feel like she had to tiptoe around someone else's life. The will had given her more than a house. It had given her her name back. Certainly. Below is the detailed narrative for Chapter 6, written in continuous prose, from a third-person perspective, without headings or formatting, and exceeding 4,000 characters in length. The house was hers now. Not just in the legal sense, though the papers had been signed and the transfer finalized with a smooth finality that seemed almost surreal. It was hers in the way that a silence becomes familiar, in the way the weight of a door closing behind you feels different when you know no one will challenge your presence. And yet, even with ownership secured and boundaries redefined, she moved through it cautiously, as though still expecting someone to question her. The walls, once indifferent, began to speak to her in quiet ways, old memories unearthed in the creak of stairs, the smell of cedar in the hallway closet, the drawer in the study that stuck slightly to the left. Her father's handwriting still lingered on a yellowed notepad near the kitchen, a half-written grocery list abandoned mid-thought. She ran her fingers over it more than once, not to decode it, but to feel the curve of his letters again. In the days after the reading of the will, Julia and Vanessa had moved out in stages, shedding their presence one box at a time. Julia left without fanfare, her face locked in practiced indifference, her words clipped and professional. She took what she could: clothes, jewelry, framed photographs, a few pieces of art she claimed had sentimental value. But the house itself, its core, she could not take. Vanessa had cried. Not for her father, but for the life she believed was rightfully hers. She left behind a trail of perfume and resentment, slamming the door with a finality that didn't quite mask the tremble in her posture. Once they were gone, the house fell into a kind of stillness she hadn't known since childhood. A peaceful emptiness. A clean slate. She began spending more time in the study, the room her father had once claimed as his own. It had always been off-limits after Julia moved in. But now, she opened it freely, windows drawn wide to let in the late afternoon sun. The walls were lined with books, thick with age and wisdom. She ran her hands across their spines, feeling the weight of years stacked neatly on shelves. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found a locked box. The key was taped to the underside of the desk drawer, exactly where she remembered him hiding small treasures when she was a child. Inside were old photographs, some of her, some of them together, laughing, playing, existing in moments that had been excluded from Julia's carefully curated narrative. There were letters, too, unsent, unspoken. Words he had written but never delivered. Apologies. Regrets. Longings. It felt like opening a door into a part of him that had been preserved just for her. He had left her more than the house. More than the accounts and stocks and legal titles. He had left her a truth. An anchor. Proof that she had mattered, that she had not imagined the bond they once shared. It had frayed, yes. It had been damaged by neglect and distraction. But it had not been broken. And in the end, he had tried to mend it the only way he knew how. She read every letter slowly, as though savoring the return of a language she thought she had forgotten. Some were about her mother, memories of their early days, confusion about why things had ended. Some were reflections on fatherhood, questions he had asked himself, doubts he had struggled to voice. One letter, dated just a few months before his death, was addressed to her directly. It read like a confession. He spoke of guilt, of the way he had stepped back when he should have stepped in, of watching her retreat and not knowing how to reach her again. He wrote that he hoped someday she would understand, and that even if she never forgave him, he wanted her to have everything she needed to build her own future, free of anyone's shadow, including his. She kept the letter in her nightstand, folded neatly inside an old book of his that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and coffee. It was a simple thing, but it grounded her. Not in grief, but in clarity. She began to move differently through the house, reclaiming spaces that had once felt foreign. She repainted the living room, tore down the heavy curtains Julia had insisted on, let in the light that had long been kept out. She planted wildflowers in the backyard where Julia's sculpted rose garden had stood, a riot of color and chaos and life. She cooked in the kitchen at night with music playing softly, her bare feet against the tile, the sound of laughter returning slowly to her throat after years of quiet. She didn't change everything. Some rooms she left untouched. The dining room table still bore the scratches from childhood projects, the hallway wall still bore the faint outline of a height chart her father had once started before Julia made him paint over it. She traced it lightly with her fingers one morning, feeling the ghost of his measuring hand, the way he used to joke that she was growing too fast. Those small marks mattered now more than anything left in a bank account. People reached out, eventually. Old family friends. Her mother. A few of her father's colleagues who had known him before the divide. They offered condolences, some sincere, some perfunctory. She accepted them with grace but held most people at a distance. Not out of coldness, but out of preservation. The rebuilding of her life was not something she wanted to share too broadly. It was quiet, deliberate, slow. She began to write again, something she hadn't done in years. Pages filled with memories, with observations, with questions she still didn't have answers for. But writing made her feel connected, to him, to herself, to the future that stretched before her now with no one left to define its boundaries. What he left her was not just property or apology. He left her a beginning. A chance to write her story without interruption. A chance to remember the man he had once been, and to forgive the one he became. She would carry both versions with her. Not out of obligation, but out of truth. The past could not be changed, but it could be reclaimed. And in that reclamation, she found a kind of peace she hadn't believed in for years. She sat one evening on the porch, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows over the grass. The wind moved through the trees gently, as if whispering a lullaby only she could hear. She closed her eyes, let the air fill her lungs, and smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because she had survived it. And that, more than anything, was what he had truly left her.